Mr. President, it is our responsibility to ensure that future generations will have greater opportunity and greater security than we inherited from our parents and our forebears. To accomplish this, we must put aside political expedience and take a sober look at the health of our national economy and our ability to keep our commitments at home and around the world. With this in mind, I rise today to urge my colleagues to reject the partisan and fiscally irresponsible Republican tax proposals in the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. When we strip away the rosy but false economic projections and ideologically motivated economic theories that Republicans have been using to hype this bill, it is clear that this bill trades away our nation's long-term economic health and the well-being of working Americans, the poor, the sick, and the old, in order to benefit the wealthy. Moreover, this bill will take us trillions of dollars deeper into debt at a time when the cost of 16 years of debt-financed wars continue to mount. Republicans owe it to our country and to future generations who will be stuck with the multi-trillion-dollar cost of this bill to go back to the drawing board and produce a balanced and permanent bipartisan path forward on our nation's broken tax code. It does not take an economist to see that the Republican tax bill is an historic $1.5 trillion transfer of wealth from poor and working Americans to the very wealthiest among us. But a few of its glaring injustices are worth mentioning. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, it gives over twice as much tax relief to millionaires as it does to Americans making under $50,000. Just 5,000 of the wealthiest American families will receive hundreds of billions of dollars over a decade in the form of estate tax breaks. At a time when income and wealth inequality in this country are at historic highs, this transfer of wealth through the estate tax alone requires us to go back to the drawing board. And on the other hand, the bill raises taxes on 19.4 million households earning under $200,000 by as much as $500. 46% of households making under $100,000 and 50% rather of households making under $75,000 will either see their taxes go up over the next decade or see no change at all. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. While tax cuts for big corporations are made permanent, the Republican bill plans to claw back what little it gives to everyone else after a few years, setting up even bigger tax hikes for the middle class down the line. And this does not even begin to cover the return of Trump care that has been added to this bill, which would take health care coverage away from 13 million Americans and drive up costs substantially for the poor, the sick, and the elderly. This bill is a bad investment, and frankly, it is one we can ill afford. According to the Penn-Wharton budget model provided by the University of Pennsylvania, the bill will reduce federal revenue by as much as $1.7 trillion and increase our national debt by $2 trillion in the 10-year budget window. By 2040, this becomes a $3.6 trillion in lost federal revenue and up to $6.9 trillion in debt. We would take on all this debt for an estimated 0.4 to 0.9% boost in GDP. For $1.5 trillion, we could, on the other hand, make needed repairs for our streets and highways across America, creating tens of thousands of jobs in the process. We could pay off every American's credit card or student loan, or lift every American above the poverty line for years. Instead, this bill would put yet another massive charge on America's credit card that will not create jobs, will not trickle down, and most certainly will not pay for itself. We still have a $5.6 trillion in deficits and interest payments from the Bush tax cuts to prove it. With over $20 trillion in national debt, it is long past time to stop experimenting with people's lives and livelihoods to prove yet again there are no merits to supply-side economics. America has pressing needs and very real bills coming due. Mr. President, I'd like to spend the remaining time of my remarks addressing something about which we have heard far too little in this debate, and that is the impact on our national economic health and of the unavoidable and compounding cost of 16 years of military conflict paid for almost entirely through debt. For the first time in our history, the United States reduced revenue in the form of the Bush tax cuts rather than the usual pay-as-you-go approach to financing the post-9/11 wars. And while we debate potentially adding trillions of dollars to the debt for an ill-conceived tax bill, the cost of war are coming due. According to calculations in the thorough report by the Cost of War Project at the Watson Institute at Brown University, even if the U.S. stopped spending on war at the end of this fiscal year, interest costs alone on borrowing to pay for the wars will continue to grow apace. Future interest costs for overseas contingency operations spending alone are projected to add more than $1 trillion to the national debt by 2023. By 2056, a conservative estimate is that the interest cost will be about $8 trillion unless the U.S. changes the way it pays for its wars. In a sense, what we are doing is mortgaging the future of our children and grandchildren as we continue to add debt. And this is unavoidable debt in so many cases. Because we know, Mr. President, we cannot immediately stop our engagement in countries throughout the world. In Afghanistan, in the Middle East, and frankly, we understand that we are facing tremendous challenges on the Korean Peninsula. The approximate combined President's budget requests for the Departments of Defense, State, and USAID for fiscal year 2018 are $14 billion for Iraq and Syria and $48.9 billion for Afghanistan. Furthermore, these costs do not account for much-needed maintenance and modernization of our military assets. For example, modernizing, operating, and sustaining our nuclear triad, which includes submarines, bombers, and ICBMs, is projected to cost $1 trillion in 2017 dollars over the next 30 years. So let me just stop for a moment. We are going to take $1.5 trillion and give it to the wealthiest Americans, when we know we need an additional $1.7 trillion over 30 years to secure the safety of the United States and the stability of the world through nuclear deterrence. Which begs the very simple question, if we want to borrow $1.5 trillion, why don't we invest it in a cost we know that will come due, protecting our country and the world through the renovation and reinvigoration of our nuclear triad? The Navy recently validated a requirement for 355 ships. This would require the Navy to purchase around 329 new ships over 30 years, an average cost of $102 billion per year through 2047, which is 13% more than the $90 billion needed to build and operate the current 254-ship fleet envisioned in the Navy's 2017 plan. Once again, we are committing ourselves to billions of dollars of cost in our Navy shipbuilding program, while we are entertaining a $1.5 or more trillion dollar tax giveaway to the wealthiest Americans. And we know these costs are coming due. Or we're fooling ourselves to think we're going to rebuild our naval forces. We can expect even greater costs of our military if we increase our end strength, as so many on both sides of the aisle are proposing. And that's because of the high operational tempo, which is not likely to diminish. For every additional 10,000 service members, it costs roughly $1.8 billion per year for pay and benefits and to train and equip these personnel. If the Army grows to 580,000 personnel, it will cost an additional $18 billion per year. But we're taking that money and we're giving it tax cuts, the predominant amount of which is going to the wealthiest Americans, we're not investing it now in increasing our military forces. If the Air Force grows by 30,000 personnel, it will cost an additional $6 billion per year. If the Marine Corps grows by 20,000 personnel, it will cost an additional $3.6 billion per year. And if you talk to the Commandant or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, they will tell you they have to increase the size of their force because of the operational tempo. Indeed, if you talk to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he will tell you they're in a desperate situation maintaining sufficient pilots to fly our aircraft. So we could be buying hundreds of new F-35 aircraft at a significant cost and watch them parked because we can't afford the flight crews to fly them and the maintainers to maintain them. We know these costs are coming, and we're ignoring them until they come due, but we're ignoring them now for the benefit of these tax cuts. If we do not chart a responsible path forward on economic policy, we will leave all these costs to the next generation, to the detriment of our children, our national security, and our position of world leadership. And frankly, it might not be even that long before they materialize. Once the markets determine that the $1.5 trillion is just a small reflection of what we have to do to protect ourselves, to continue our commitment in Afghanistan, to continue to support allies across the globe, they will know very quickly that the deficit is beginning to devour us, and the markets will react, as they have in the past. So we could see this problem created and causing a wicked market reaction long before even our children confront these debts. That's why earlier today, former Secretaries of Defense Leon Panetta, Chuck Hagel, and Ash Carter sent a letter to congressional leadership and the House and Senate Armed Services Committee warning us that the fiscal irresponsibility of the Republican tax proposal will continue to a growing budget crisis and contribute to that crisis. The letter urges Congress to instead address this question that threatens to hollow out our military ability to sustain the commitments of its global mission. Mr. President, tax policies have real consequences. We can debate the value of one tax proposal over another, but this is not the debate before us. The simple fact that this tax bill will give breaks to people who need it least, take money from working Americans, leave millions of Americans sicker and worse off, and further strain our ability to keep America safe from growing and changing and challenging threats across the globe. It also threatens expenditures on healthcare, education, infrastructure, and other vital domestic needs as the deficit balloons due to this bill's unaffordable tax breaks for corporate titans. This is not what we owe the next generation. It's not even what we owe to our children today. And I urge my colleagues across the aisle to consider our nation's future and join us in opposing this legislation. Like so many here, I was here in 2001 when President George W. Bush came with his tax cuts, which I opposed, which assured us that our economy would grow, jobs would multiply, we would be fine. Let me remind my colleagues, when he said that, after the tough decisions we made in the Clinton administration, we had a projected surplus of roughly $5 billion. In fact, the mantra for many people was, let's give the money back to the American people. We don't have a surplus today. We have a significant deficit. It will grow with this bill because this bill says we're going to increase it by $1.5 trillion at a minimum, and it won't be just 1.5. What I'm suggesting also is, unless we abandon our commitments to the men and women of our armed forces, unless we decide to disengage from the deterrence that we must have to defend the nation from a nuclear Armageddon, unless we decide to leave Afghanistan after the president announced no longer are we basing our decisions on time, it's now conditions, there are trillions and trillions of dollars of unavoidable cost already that should be included in our deficit. This is not the time to take trillions of dollars and giving it in disproportionate share to the wealthiest Americans. This is a time for us to work together, to provide the resources for our military, to provide the investment for our people, to deal with the issue of inequality between the wealthiest 1% and everybody else. None of that is accomplished by this bill. In fact, this bill will complicate, compound, and make even more difficult the problems we face to defend the nation and give people a chance at a better future. And with that, I yield the floor.